Ah, First of all, I'm happy that you managed to dedicate 1 hour or 1 hour and a half of your time. It's good to see you again. We haven't spoken to each other for maybe a year and so. And
Yeah, yeah.
how would you underline your research in Jordan regarding the tribal policies?
Sure.
Now,
So
when
thanks so much for
you defended your PhD, and how would you summarize your research?
yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for talking to me. It's lovely to speak to you again. So I would say that my research is primarily focused on what we might call the politics of the margins and non-state forms of sovereignty. So I came to this, originally I was interested in Bedouin in Jordan. I worked for a while with Bedouin in Petra, who'd been sedentarized and relocated by a state initiative outside of the Petra National Park. And I was following much more of a traditional anthropological study of sedentarization, a kind of in political anthropology. There's been a lot of interest in the ways that nomads settle and are made to settle in the Middle East and beyond. What I wanted to do in this study was to take a kind of a longue durée historical approach to this. And I also wanted to look at it more from a point of view of politics. So what makes nomadic pastoralists and, in Jordan, Bedou, culturally distinctive and culturally, socio-culturally, and indeed politically significant, even in a contemporary setting. So where is this sort of political significance coming from? And indeed, beyond Jordan, this is an important question too. Because across the Middle East, we've seen a collapse in the economic significance of mobile pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism, and yet the sort of social categories, the idea of being Bedouin and of it carrying a certain socio-cultural cachet, if you will, has kind of continued. And we also see across the region the persistence, especially in Jordan, of the importance of categories of Qabila and Ashira. So I wanted to explore the conditions of possibility for these sort of continuities in a way, and their kind of political realities. Starting really from the late Ottoman period and the British Mandate, and the kind of intervention of the British Mandate, which codified a lot of things, and the Bedouin control laws and various other interventions, right the way through to the present through ethnographic field work, mostly among the Sukhur and the Hamaida around Madaba, looking at pathways to villagization, issues around land ownership, issues also around everyday politics, sort of the way leadership and authority are conceived of in these communities. So that's the sort of the long and the short of my research, I guess.
Compared to the lifestyle 40, 50 years ago, not to mention British Mandate and Ottoman time, how the lifestyle transformed during the last decades of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan?
Obviously enormously, but in an uneven way. And I think the unevenness is important here. So one of the key villages I worked in was Walid, which is just east of Madaba, between Madaba and Zizia. In a kind of, it's one of a group of kind of Bani Sakha dominated villages. And, in 1952, where Jordan's first housing survey was conducted, there were no permanent structures in Walid at all. There were a couple of animal shelters made in the ruins of the old Qusur, the old Umayyad era palace there. But there were no permanent settlements. And now, there are no full-time nomads in Walid. So that's happened all within the last 70 years, and primarily within the last 40 years. The other area I worked in, Jabal Bani Hamida, stone houses were always used seasonally people tended to have a stone house, or at least a stone, a sort of a stone structure of some form, or sometimes made a betatin, a sort of straw and mud house, which they'd use for storage, but they were still semi-nomadic. And the big changes there have more been in things like in many of the villages in Jabal Bani Hamida, there was almost no road access to Diban until the 1970s and 1980s, and there was no electricity or government services until the 1990s. And equally, so in many ways, life has become easier, but one thing that sort of is countering that is the shortage of water in Jabal Bani Hamida. The Wala River is very significant for irrigation in that whole larger area and for agricultural jobs, and that's fallen year on year. And particularly as a lot of the water from that is now needed in Amman. There's a pipe which is taking it to Amman as it expands. And as a result of this, combined with reductions in the price of meat, pastoralism has been especially devalued in Jabal Bani Hamida, to the point that the local weaving project there, which used to use wool from Jabal Bani Hamida, is now using imported wool, wool imported from, I think, Australia and New Zealand, because local wool takes too much water just to wash it. So there's even less incentive to keep animals. You have had some initiatives to try and grow olives and almonds in the Jabal Bani Hamida area, but again, water is the big problem. So you have a position, a situation there, and in the Sahor villages where agriculture has become very precarious, and most people, if they keep any animals, they'll primarily keep them to use domestically to produce meat for important family occasions. Say they need to create a mensaf or something for a funeral or a wedding, but they won't make their primary income from herding, and often only one brother in a family will remain with the herds. And instead, people have made their living primarily for the last 30 or 40 years through working for the military and the government. And it's getting increasingly hard for them to find jobs. And one way a lot of people have been able to continue to live and to have access to money for important things like housing and weddings is to sell land. And this is much easier in the Bani Sakha areas where the land is near enough to Amman that with urban expansion it's become valuable, and people have been able to speculate and to sell various legal land in various different types of legal category. In Jabal Bani Hamida, the land has not really risen in value so much, so there's a big problem. And obviously this area is a big source of unrest within Jordan, particularly Diban. So yes, that's sort of, there's been remarkable social change, but quite different social change between the two areas I looked into, where my ethnography is set.
How would you point out nomadic pacification and sedenterization in Jordan, and what was the turning point for these processes?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think in traditional Arabic scholarship, as well as a sort of more recent European scholarship, the sort of dichotomy between Badu and Falahin, or Badu and Hadar, is really stark and exact. But of course, in reality, lots of Arab tribes have moved between the two categories, depending on seasonal conditions, depending on broader historical movements in the region. So we saw, like in the Mamluk era, a lot of Jordan was given over to settled agriculture. There were a number of villages. And we see during the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the late Ottoman Empire, a period of devillagization across not just Jordan, but across the whole of the Badia, across the whole of sort of Greater Syria, really. And we see these big camel herding noble tribes, Asad tribes from Najd coming north, people like the Shamar, the Bani Sakha, sort of series of movements in the Anaza, Rawla. And in all this time, there's a sort of almost a re-nomad, we talk about sedentarization, but there's a sort of desedentarization that goes on in the centuries beforehand. I think when things really start to change is Well, one large turning point is the construction of the Hijaz Railway, which firstly led to a reduction in the need for Bedouin as escorts and providers of camels for the Hajj. It also allowed the Ottomans to project authority and telegram lines further into the desert. The next, I think, big turning point, because in some ways a lot of that Ottoman work at pacification began to become undone with the Arab Revolt. But I think a big turning point was the British Mandate, and in particular, sort of the period from which, sort of in the very late 1920s to early 1930s, when the famous John Bagot Glub Basha took over the Desert Patrol and eventually the Arab Legion and started to really impose the first sort of structured sedentarization and pacification program on the Jordanian Badia. And of course, I think he was helped by all sorts of natural and political circumstances beyond British colonial policy. You had in the 1930s a kind of perfect storm for a lot of Bedouin. You had the global problems of the Great Depression, a collapse in the price of camels and goats. You had a serious drought in 1928. And on top of this, you had the Ikhwan raids from Najd, from the Saudi state, and a lot of people in this time lost almost all their livestock. And because of this, they were particularly susceptible to government pacification efforts from Glubb and his Desert Patrol. So, you know, military employment, but also military welfare and the provision of government work, seed crops, all acted in his favor to encourage people to accept sedentarization. You also had in this period a few important legal changes. You had the mandate. Under the mandate, you had firstly imposition of a new system of land survey and registration, which meant that the sort of fluidity of the concept of diras, tribal category of land, was sort of more tied down by the British, and it became harder for sheikhs to avoid registering land. And you also had the imposition of the Bedouin control laws, which codified tribal law and dispute resolution, and recognized certain tribes as Bedouin. There were about 13 tribes, although the number kind of changed at different points in the mandate as to who was included and who wasn't, who would be placed into a sort of special category of government in the Badia under Glubb. And they were more, you know, Glubb in time, certainly by the mid 1930s, had quite a commanding position among the Badia tribes. And I think so the turning point, I think, was probably, you would place in the late 1920s, early 1930s. An earlier one, which sometimes gets mentioned, and I know the American anthropologist Andrew Shryack has talked about a lot, was the Adwan rebellion in the early 1920s against Amir Abdullah. But my work, because it focuses more on the Badia tribes, particularly the Sukhur, there I feel like the big turning point came in the 1930s. And then again, I think, you know, as I said, really, after this turning point, it was quite a slow process. It was quite a slow road towards sedentarization. And it was one that, even as the Bedouin gave up their mobility as noble camel herding tribes and increasingly adopted first of all, goats and sheep, some settled agriculture, and eventually mostly military and government jobs. Even as this happened, at least the leadership, the sort of sheikhly elites, maintained a position of commanding influence. And in part, my research looks as to why that was. You know, back in the 1920s, Amir Abdullah had to seek alliances with the large, most important Bedouin tribes like the Sukhur, and you know, and at that time the Sheikh Mashayikh of the Sukhur was Mithgal al-Fayez. in order to defend Jordan against the Ikhwan raids, and then therefore it was very important because the Bedouin were an important military component of the sort of alliance that would become the Emirate of Jordan, Transjordan. By the 1950s, that's not really the case anymore. But the Sukhor and particularly the El Fayez family maintains their centrality, as do many other Bedouin lineages, partly because of associations with military service and for various other reasons, which I explore in my thesis. So, I think the ability of the state to kind of deploy Bedouin as a sort of cultural and symbolic force within Jordan has meant that this pacification process in some ways is still not entirely complete. There's still an idea that Bedouin citizens in some way, or at least certain families, have a type of political relationship which is unusual, put it like that.
How controllable are Bedouins in 21st century by Jordanian state? You've been working with local tribes in Madaba for 2-3 years, and how these tribes are controllable by the state apparatus? Are they some kind of a state within the state, or they are incorporated in Jordanian state?
So I think they are definitely incorporated into the state. And I think it's important to point out that, at least for sheikhs, the sort of big sheikhly families, they always got money for being part of the state. They were always paid pensions by the Ottomans. They expected presents from Emir Abdullah in order to buy their loyalty and their military support. They've always benefited from states. They're not sort of stateless or sort of atavistically hostile to the idea of the state. In the 21st century, I think one problem that we've seen is that as Jordan's economic situation has shifted and the state has, Jordan has undergone structural adjustment and the state has had to shrink back a bit and provide a bit less social welfare, it's become harder for rural East Bankers, especially for Bedouin, to make a living off government work and pensions and military positions. And you've also seen problems around land ownership, which I can go into perhaps later if it's of interest. So you have seen protests coming from these East Bank areas. But I think it's important not to overestimate the degree to which tribes are states within a state in Jordan. Tribal law and dispute resolution is important, and there's something called the Palace Convention in Jordan, which your listeners may not be aware of, whereby the state does sort of give semi-official recognition to tribal dispute resolution, but it's often overstated. So a lot of young shabab in Madaba would tell, young guys would tell me that if they have any problems, the police will not go to their village, but rather a sheikh or someone with wasta will go to the local governor or a government minister perhaps, and they'll have coffee with him in his office, and it'll all be sorted like that. And that sometimes happens, but it's not the only way things happen. People do get coerced, especially in the Hamaida area. There are police, and we saw this in 2016, where unemployed young men in Diban erected the unemployment tent, and the Jordanian gendarmerie were able to disperse that and pull it down. So, the state's reach is growing, and there's enormous dissatisfaction with it. But I would say it would be, I think sometimes it's in the interests of tribal leaders and tribal authorities to overestimate their own importance and to oversuggest that they are a state within a state. The other thing that's happening, which I think is interesting and bears on this question, is that we increasingly see tribal Facebook groups springing up, which don't necessarily involve recourse to sheikhs and the old men that traditionally control these systems. So we see people sharing information, tribal Facebook memes, images they've created, and sometimes even call answer collective insults online without going through these traditional authorities. And this is something which is very problematic, and you know, there have been discussions in the Jordanian parliament about this. It's quite a controversial issue, shall we say, but it's definitely something that happens. And so I think the important point in that is that even though the actual situation, the political situation, has really shifted, and it would be a mistake to think of the tribes as a state within a state, there is still a widespread assumption, a widespread association that Bedouin, that particularly certain Bedouin in rural areas are more difficult to coerce or to govern, and more restive, and have to be treated with more care by the state and state authorities. And I think that does have political consequences when we look at the sort of in some ways, the long-lasting nature of the Diban Hirak compared to other protest movements.
What can you say about the Hirak movement? Because we have movements with a similar agenda in other Arab states. How different Jordanian version of Hirak is from, let's say, Hirak movement in Northern Africa? And in general, what was your impression about Hirak movement while you were researching in Jordan?
Yeah, I think that a movement in general by scholars and political scientists to focus more on the importance of rural protest movements in the Arab uprising since 2010. And the rural protest movements have often been completely overshadowed by the big urban middle class set pieces, you know, Tahrir Square, etc. Yeah. And even in Jordan, you know, the attention grabbing protests have always been in Amman. It was sort of Dua Dakhliya in 2011 and the Dua Rabia in 2018. And in both cases, I think it's probably fair to say that the majority of protesters were coming out in support of the Islamic Action Front and the Muslim Brotherhood, rather than labor unions, which are associated with with Hirak. You know, people from Diban Hirak and Bani Hamida students in Amman did take part in the big urban set piece protests, but they weren't the overwhelming majority. What these protests have shown, though, is that they are the particularly Diban Hirak has been particularly strident in its calls for reform and change. It's criticized. It's made criticisms, pretty strident criticisms, of the royal house directly, rather than just the prime minister and the government. And I think the other important thing from that perspective is that it's kept going, so that you tend to have Julian Schwedler talks about this as well in her work. There have been sort of waves of protest which tend to be dealt with through promises of reform, certain people getting appointments, you know, through Wasta, and perhaps the prime minister is changed, and then it dies down, and then it comes back again after a few years. The Hirak has really smoldered on throughout, at least the kind of core of it in towns like Diban, and so it's been quite different in that sense. It would be a mistake, though, to suggest it's very organized and very united. My understanding, and you know, I wasn't directly researching the Hirak leadership by any means, but my impression was that it was primarily acephalous, that it was being driven by several different interests. You had different figures that often spoke for it, some of whom were primarily focused on political issues around sort of freedom of expression, democratic reform, more and particularly more inclusion of areas like Diban and the wider Bani Hamida area in politics. And other people who are primarily focused on unemployment and economic issues, and who primarily were if anything, really criticizing the IMF and structural adjustment and Jordan's decision to follow the kind of neoliberal path of economics, and who really wanted more state support, more welfare, better conditions under which to revive agriculture. So I think you had that sort of difference between the sort of politically focused and the economically focused. And the people who were more focused on the economic issues, who I'd say were probably the majority, tended to be a little less radical in some ways and a little less, certainly less openly critical of the royal house. And you had various figures who have gained quite a bit of media traction as well, who've, even if not directly involved in Iraq, have sort of supported it publicly. You have various political figures who are to various degrees oppositional, I suppose you would say, in Jordan, who have kind of joined up, and they have an important role too in joining up these little rural Iraq movements, the sort of the popular movements in small rural towns, with broader patterns of kind of trade union activity. Labor unions are a fascinating topic in Jordan and something I'd like to do more research on in the future. But the teachers union was suppressed after the 1950s, briefly came back and then was disbanded again. And you have the dock workers strikes in Aqaba from 2008. You have the veterans, the military veterans protests. You have various, and all these different movements. There are certain political and intermediary figures who have acted to kind of join them up and to talk about these things as though they were all to do with one thing, the kind of Iraq in the broader sense. But I think certainly my experience is that on the ground, protest in these places is pretty organic. It's not particularly directed. It's mostly focused on economic grievances, and attempts to slot it into a kind of broad political movement are a little bit problematic and not very convincing for me anyway.
What primary sources did you use, and what secondary sources did you use during your research?
So in terms of the more historical stuff, one excellent source of information which a lot of people have used is General Glubb's papers, which are now in St. Anthony's College, Oxford, in the Middle East Centre archives there. So you've got his, and of particular interest are his monthly reports, which exist from every month since 1929 to when he left Jordan in 1956. You've also got a wealth of other material in his files, correspondence, some of which is very interesting, regarding the sort of drafting of the Bedouin control laws. There's also quite a large amount of primary material in Kew, the British National Archives, especially regarding the sort of Britain's land reforms in Jordan, land survey and settlement. I was quite keen to access the Department for Land and Survey to look at some of these issues directly. And I had some very interesting meetings with officials there, but I wasn't granted access to the archives. However, luckily, an American historian called Michael Fischbach, I don't know whether you know him.
I haven't read anything about him.
He hasn't been to Jordan for a while now, I think. Or I think he's primarily working on the West Bank now. But he had been to the archives in the late 1990s, and luckily had made pretty detailed notes of some of the sort of survey files for the Bani Sakha about the sort of the process of survey and land settlement. So I was able to get those notes from him, which have been invaluable. His published work as well. He did a book on land in Jordan in 2006, which I really recommend, and that reproduces a lot of the 1952 housing data survey, and is an excellent source. I mean, another thing I drew on very heavily was oral histories from, particularly in Jabal Bani Hamida, which were facilitated by Halima Abu Qader, who was then manager of the Bani Hamida Women's Weaving NGO. And I believe she's now, in fact, standing for Parliament for her area. And she was very kind to facilitate a number of meetings in Jabal Bani Hamida with sheikhs and village muhtars, as well as beneficiaries of her project, many of whom were older men and women who were able to share with me quite detailed life histories. So I was able to record for about, I think I had 12 individuals I tracked from sort of back through the generations. So at what point the first permanent house was built, at what point settlement took place, when was the first member of the family to go to school, these sort of questions, so you can get a sense of life history and social change. And then I lived in Madaba for my during my field work, I should say, and you know, I also benefited from you know, regular sort of participant observation with young Zuhur and Hamaida men in Madaba, who I got to know, talked to, often visited them and their universities, their workplaces. And later on, when I got to know them better, I'd go home to their villages and meet their families, and conduct semi-structured interviews with as wide a variety of people in these areas as possible, really.
Yesterday I read an interesting article sent by a friend called Jordan's End with Transition, and the author Ursula Lindsay, an American who claims that she's an expert for a variety of countries in the region, for Syria, for Jordan, for Egypt, for Morocco, which is a bit pretentious, because we're talking about very heterogeneous region, and to claim that you're an expert for 10 or 15 states or 5 states sounds very, very pretentious to me. Anyway, she claims that in isolated towns in the hinterland, the figure of unemployment rises to 90%. You've been living in Madaba area, you dealt with rural population. Did you have the impression that unemployment amongst them was 90%?
I wouldn't say among the people I knew that was the case. No, most of the families I knew had more employment than that. I mean, if you're talking, well, I'm trying to think now, because if you're presumably this is
yeah, 90% is very high unemployment.
It is. But yeah, I mean, particularly in Madaba, I think the situation is a bit different, because there are various opportunities for informal employment.
Listen, they have higher employment in Gaza, Strip, which is completely isolated and suffocated by Israeli military blockade. And still in Gaza, the percentage of unemployment is a little bit above 40%.
Yeah.
At least
I mean, what do you count as unemployment? Because many
of them work on their land. First of all, many of them have their agricultural land, and most of them combine the income from agriculture with their salaries. Let's say at state institutions or public sector, if they work in public sector, because many of them also work in private sector. I think it's outdated division that some of scholars or some of experts mention all the time, that East bankers are employed in military, police, and the public sector, because de facto in my newspaper, which is the state newspaper, most of my colleagues are West bankers, and all of my editors-in-chief and assistant editor-in-chiefs were Palestinian Arabs. So
I think you would say it's something
things are not that simple. It's not black and white.
It was something that was much more true in the 1980s and 1990s.
Or in 1970s, after Black September. Now we live in
Yeah, media
2020, and the
numbers.
population changed. So I don't think that it's a correct figure to claim that unemployment in the rural area is 90%.
No, I'd say that's an exaggeration. But certainly there is a large problem, particularly, most families I knew weren't really happy for women to commute for work. So if they
Okay.
lived in Madaba, maybe some women
Yeah.
could work, but in villages it wasn't possible. And then the other problem is that, sure, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of East Banker families, even in rural areas, would be willing to work outside of the military and government work. But they have those connections of Worcester, which are so important for getting work, mean that they kind of have to go where they know people. And so even though I think it's changing, and particularly in places like Amman and even in Madaba, it's changing less in the villages where people kind of are, there's more path dependency in a sense.
True, and
People have to go
you
where they
have
know.
less job opportunities in villages. What kind of
Terrible
industry?
job opportunities.
What kind of
Well,
industry, or what kind of service sector you would have in the middle of nowhere in the
yeah.
hinterland?
I mean, in Jabal Bani Hamida, you can commute to Diban, and there you can there's a little bit of factory work where you might make enough to cover your bus fare to Diban every day, but barely more than that. So there's no incentive to even do
True.
those jobs really. And I knew people like in Al Walid who worked in the Ministry of Finance, and they had to get a bus in every morning to Madaba, which took nearly an hour. And then in Madaba, they waited for the ministry bus, which then took another hour, depending on traffic. So it's a huge, long commute.
True.
It's very hard. Obviously, it's easier for people who own cars. So I think, yeah, the pattern is changing, but I think it's there are big problems. I mean, and I certainly, unlike the scholar you were just mentioning, won't claim broad regional knowledge, because I do try and focus on Jordan.
It's not the scholar. I think that person is some kind of a columnist for different
I see.
different media, like
Yes,
Al.
I did see this article in the New York Times. I think I know
Yeah, she
the
writes
one
in
you
New
mean.
York Times and Financial Times, and
I
also
see.
she's
Yeah,
a member of the committee to protect journalists, which is always
but
suspicious. This is always suspicious to me. People who are in these committees always have hidden agendas.
yeah,
More or less. Their agenda is always political, because I personally, although I work in the media, don't believe in free media. Free media doesn't exist. You always have to have editorial policy. You have to have your own political agenda, whether
yeah.
you're the state-run
No one's
media
coming.
or private
No
media.
one's
So
coming from nowhere.
I don't believe in 100% free media. I think,
But I think
yes,
I would agree with a broader regional point, from my reading of this article anyway, which is that this isn't just a problem unique to Jordan, and I don't think it's even a problem unique to the Arabic-speaking countries or even the Middle East. It's the problem of young people, especially young rural people, in a kind of a rapidly changing economy where
true,
we're seeing automation, new trade links, a decline of industry. This is a huge problem everywhere. The one sort of sociological anthropological term you hear a lot at the moment is waithood, which is this idea of an extension after adolescence, but before adulthood. You have a period of waithood where you're stuck kind of waiting for your life to begin. And this is something I saw a lot in the Bedouin villages in Jordan. You get people who really can't ever see their way to getting enough money together to marry, or to move out with their parents, or to, they don't want to move out from their parents necessarily. They just want to have a floor of their own, or a house next door or something. And they can't even see their way to that, and in terms of being able to offer hospitality, to be able to afford to invite people for important occasions, they can't afford it. And because of this, they kind of feel that their route to social adulthood has been blocked, that it's really hard to become an adult, to become a man, in a sense. It's mostly young men I worked with, obviously, though my wife got to know a lot of their female relations as well. So I think this is a broad regional problem, and it's something that's driving protests. It certainly had a large role in driving the Arab uprisings, but it's having a role in protests really everywhere, and especially in the global south.
Regarding the global south, can you draw the parallel between rural population in Jordan and rural population in the UK? Because we just spoke about the lack of perspective for youngsters who are stuck in the countryside. How that problem is addressed in the UK?
Yes, yeah, it's a very interesting question.
What was the situation with villagers in areas like Scotland or Wales?
Well, I think one thing that is different and changes the dynamic slightly is Jordan, particularly rural Bedouin Jordan, is still somewhere where family and extended family is extremely important, and people kind of want to live within very close range of their parents and their broader kin networks. People were often absolutely horrified in Jordan when I told them how often I saw my parents, which was, during fieldwork, not for nearly a year. My mother came out in the middle and visited me, and that was a big event, and everyone was really excited and thought it was wonderful. But this is it. In England, I think one important response has been that a lot of rural areas have been gutted because young people have just moved away and left them. And you see this a lot in other parts of the Arab world. This has certainly happened in Egypt. I think it's happened to some degree in Jordan. But Jordan is still a small country, and I think it's happened less. And in many of these villages, people don't really feel they have the finances or the prospects to leave the village, to take this kind of leap, because actually a lot of the kind of jobs within reach, the best they could hope for would be 400 dinars a month, and if they had to then rent accommodation on top of this, it becomes financially only just worth their while, potentially. So, yeah. And meanwhile, in the UK, I think you've seen, I come from a rural and relatively disadvantaged area in Cornwall, and you've seen a lot of villages really just left to the elderly. Young families can't find work there, so they move away. Children move away when they can, and often you do have some young people remaining who often do struggle to find employment, and often are forced to rely on informal and seasonal employment. So it's a big problem everywhere. What we have seen recently in the UK, strangely, as a consequence of the pandemic, is that a lot of people working from home have decided to move out of the cities and back into villages. There's been this kind of outpouring from London as people decide actually how much nicer they find life, not in a very expensive and polluted metropolis, and they'd rather live where they could have more space. So you're seeing a bit of a counter trend. The problem really is that though that with COVID, you've seen a speeding up of a much more long-term trend in the UK of the sort of jobs that young people get are more and more unstable, more and more patchy. More and more people are working in hospitality or the gig economy when they leave school, or even when they leave university. And as a consequence of this, I think a lot of people are finding the idea of being able to put down roots to sort of maintain a rural community almost impossible to imagine. Buying property, staying in one place, being able to build your life around a single small community, it doesn't fit with the economics anymore.
To go back to the Middle East, how would you underline political anthropology of Jordan compared to other Arab states in this region? How Jordan is unique, or how Jordan is similar to other countries, other Arab
I'm sure
countries?
Yeah. So you'll be aware that it's become a bit of a cliche in the political science sphere of studies on Jordan to talk about Jordanian exceptionalism. And I think it's been massively overplayed how unique Jordan is.
Yeah,
the stability of Jordan.
Yeah, this is very problematic notion, and I always had the impression that Arab states in general are associations of tribes rather than states in modern political sense. It works in Jordan, it works in other countries in the region. It's more of association of tribes.
Yeah, I think what we did see in Jordan, what historically happened in Jordan, because of the nature of the mandate, which wanted to govern Jordan on the cheap in a way, it didn't have a lot of funds. The British state didn't want to invest a lot of funds in governing Jordan. And then you had a kind of situation where Emir Abdullah, because of this, had to set up the Emirate of Transjordan through alliances and deals rather than through the coercive power of a state. I think to some degree there was a degree of coercion, which I don't want to underplay. You know, some tribes were strafed by aeroplanes. There were military actions, but I mean, by and large, there was more perhaps alliance making and deal making than in, say, certainly in the British mandate in Iraq, and to some extent the French mandate in Syria, although they had their own system of kind of patronage and encompassment going on with the tribes there. But I think because of this in Jordan, in some ways, and because of the survival of the royal house, the system of tribal patronage politics, if you want to call it that, is much more continuous and much more accepted and blatant than it is in other states, which have had a kind of veneer of Arab socialist, Republican, Nasserist or Ba'athist ideology put on top of them. You know, I think various scholars have looked at similar things in Syria, especially Dawn Chatty, where I think, you know, the certainly the in the immediate post-independence period, Bedouin and tribes were considered almost a kind of developmental problem, something that needed to be developed, something that was backward and alarming. And I think this even, I'm not so much of an expert on Syria, but this continued into the early Ba'athist period. But then later on, Hafez al-Assad sought powerful political alliances with these tribes and made much more use of them politically. And I think similar things happened in Iraq, less so in Egypt, from my understanding. But in Jordan, you never really had so much of a developmental drive to prevent such things. It was never sort of driven underground and then re-emerged like it did in Syria. It was always, to a degree, accepted and to some degree even valorized as kind of part of the structure of the state. And I think, you know, since, particularly after Black September, King Hussein really emphasized sort of Bedouinization of the military, as we've already sort of touched on this, but the Bedouin is a kind of symbol of the loyal original East Bank Jordanian. So I think, you know, that because of that, it in other places, patronage politics and even the politics of tribalism has been significant. In Jordan, it's taken on a particular kind of aesthetic, in a sense, because of its acceptance and celebration by the state. I think the other thing in Jordan that's slightly unusual is because of the kind of the way the royal house has operated. You know, you've had you had one brief sort of experiment with Arab national socialism in sort of nationalism and socialism in 1956 under Salman Nabulsi's government. But since then, really, the government has been primarily concerned with you know, the primary purpose of government is the sort of continuation of the royal house and the continuation of Jordan as an entity. So patronage in Jordan, my understanding would be, while you could talk about, in almost any political context globally, you could talk about the importance of patronage networks, kinship networks. Mm-hmm. this isn't even just in the Arab speaking world or the Middle East. This is a sort of universal thing.
It's universal, of course.
Analyzing the state and the non-state. But in Jordan, it even come in Jordan because of that what we were talking about, the way the royal house has in some ways come to encompass the state. Jordan's represented as a family, and the king is its father. And this sort of imagery is everywhere. And because of this, you have you have an idea of the kind of Jordan as a house and a set of lineages, and as a family. And I think, it's important that since the 2000s, even beyond my area of sort of the Bedouin villages and tribal areas, even in East Amman among Jordanians who are descended from people who came from Palestine, you have family associations, right? And these are often huge groups of many thousands of people.
True. But they cluster in East Amman and Zarga, like in the hive.
Yeah,
and
precisely.
You have areas of Ashrafia where one clan, one tribe is concentrated, whether they are from Tafila, like those guys. Like those guys in Jabal Jofa and Jabal Taj. And of course, you have other families from the West Bank. There's nothing wrong with these things.
Yeah, but in Jordan, the crucial thing is, right, that the family association is a legal entity, which it can have a committee, it can have a common treasury, it can receive development funding from the state. And in some ways, it fills in for the state, and particularly in providing social welfare for its members, much like the tribe does. And because of this, it's not kind of tribes versus the state. It's government, the state power and government power trickles down through families and through family heads in Jordan in a way that is not unique, but is unusual in the way it's emphasized and valorized compared to other countries where other political systems rather, where this sort of thing happens, but it's not sort of made part of the state and it's not sort of celebrated in the same way.
My last question will be about your future plans. What are you planning to do with your studies, and are you planning to come back to Jordan and continue your research on tribes and the Hirak movement?
I definitely will continue researching Jordan. Yes, I really hope. I'd hope to come back this autumn. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, it's not possible at the moment. Inshallah, next summer I'll come, but it also slightly depends on funding. I mean, I'm sort of negotiating exactly when and how at the moment. My next research project actually will there's two elements actually. Firstly, I want to return to Jabal Bani Hamida, but specifically to research discourses of water scarcity and the way people conceive of water scarcity. And I think this is a really big issue. Again, it's a global issue, but with particular local texture in an area like Jabal Bani Hamida, where some people want to revive pastoralism and agriculture, but where water is increasingly a problem. And I think, Hussam Hussein, you may know, has written a lot on the hydropolitics of Jordan, and it's a very interesting area.
I published 2 or 3 articles about his research.
So I'd like to do some research on that. The other thing I want to research directly is discourses of corruption. I'm very interested in the anthropology of corruption, and of course, Hirak protesters and many other people talk about corruption as a problem, facade in Arabic. And I'm interested in the ways which ideas of facade and wasta are kept separate as discourses, and the way people try and maintain a clear division between networking and using patronage and actual corruption, and the ways those two things become conflated. And I plan to do that research partly in the same communities in Jabal Bani Hamida and Diban, but I also want to do some research in Amman, and possibly even looking at the structures of family associations, which are another long-term research interest of mine. So those are my plans, I hope, and yeah, hopefully I will be able to return for fieldwork in Jordan in 2021, pandemic permitting.
Let's see how it goes, because the pandemic doesn't seem to cease. And
indeed, yeah.
If you come in 2021, you should maybe better plan your research and your arrival, regardless of the pandemic. If you wait for the end of the pandemic, you may wait longer than 1 year.
It's just yeah, we just need to wait for a time when travel restrictions are relaxed, particularly regarding. For me, it's as much a matter of my university insurance won't cover me to go at the moment. But yeah, I think eventually, I hope we'll find a sort of a new modus vivendi, a new normal, and we'll be able to carry on research again.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You emphasize lots of information that maybe people in general are not aware of. And this is just the first of talks that I'm planning to do with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was lovely to speak to you.